Hello and welcome to ChinaTalk. In exciting personal news, I'm now an adjunct fellow at CNAS, which is awesome, but unfortunately it does not pay. If you're interested in hiring me full-time or as a consultant, please reach out. The sooner you do, the sooner I will stop asking for work on this show. Also, have you ever thought to yourself, man, I really wish I could pour my morning coffee in a ChinaTalk mug, or see a Jordan Schneider hand-drawn postcard of Jiang Zemin or Bo Xilai on my fridge? Now, here's your chance. The folks at glow.fm who run my donations have set up a referral tracker for the podcasts, and the 10 listeners who refer the most people get their choice of either mug or postcard. Please go to refer.glow.fm/ChinaTalk, get your referral code, text your friends, and tell them to start listening. Do note that we recorded this episode on Wednesday, October 13th, one day before Daryl Mori and the Houston Rockets parted ways. We have two lawyers turned sports podcasters, Hunter Scher, who runs the Mandarin language 翻转体育, or Sports Inverted, and Nate Duncan of Dunk on Basketball. First off, Hunter, can you give us a little bit of history of basketball in China? How did it get to the level it is as being one of the most popular sports on the mainland?
I tend to view most of the modern sports or most of the current sports presence in China either inspired by foreign presence in China or like they were literally brought in by like foreign missionaries probably 80 years ago or 100 years ago. And I think basketball was among the same group brought in by the missionaries when they were starting to found colleges back in Shanghai, in Tianjin, in Beijing. This was like Republic era. And then when we were talking about modern basketball presence and the popularity, it's mostly started from the 80s, I would say. The popularity was Michael Jordan. First time we viewed them on the television, that was in the 90s when I think David Stern had a very hard but worthy deal for the NBA to put on the show in the CCTV5 for free for several years. And that was literally the first group of fan base from Michael Jordan. I think some people even watched some bit of Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. And then starting from there, we obviously have Yao, and Yao proposed or pushed the NBA into the mainstream popularity in China. And then Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and then you got this new generation, maybe including myself, that we just grew up with Yao literally in our very first memory of professional sports. And we're just used to NBA being there. But when I was actually preparing for this episode, I was realizing that, for example, I was watching this YouTube video by an animator who were, I think, recreating a show or an anime called Slam Dunk by Takehiko Inoue, which is a famous Japanese manga artist.
Sure.
Also super huge, actually, contributing to, I think, for the 80s, the Balingho, the post-80s, the post-90s, their first group of popularity of like basketball fans in China as well. I like intuitively speaking, it seems like it's like directly inspired by NBA or the globalization of professional basketball. But I literally just realized that how Japanese influences like these manga also contributed to the popularity right now.
Yeah, and that's an interesting little irony because, of course, like the NBA is not huge in Japan, but there just happened to be this one kind of weirdo animator who ended up making a big hit, and it wasn't necessarily based on the fact that basketball was so popular in Japan, but just that he was incredibly talented. Sure. Nate, can you talk a little bit about this from the NBA side? What were the sort of main efforts by Stern and later Silver, and how important is China to the NBA today?
Obviously, in the media here in 2002, when Yao was about to get drafted, there was a lot of discussion about how they had to negotiate that with the Chinese Communist Party to have him come over and what percentage of his earnings were going to go back to the Chinese Communist Party and how much he was going to be able to play on the national team and stuff like that. But I think there was a thought that, number one, it was going to be a really important component of the NBA's future business. And people obviously always talk about the Chinese market in any kind of a business here. And then number two, there was a thought that there are going to be a lot of Chinese players who are going to be really good. And one of the things was like, yeah, think of how big the population is. And you would hear these wild rumors of, they've got 107 footers that are just like waiting to come over because their population is so big. And obviously that's never materialized, I think, to the disappointment of just about everyone. I think everyone would love for there to be more Chinese players capable of playing in the NBA. But outside of Yao, no one has really made an impact. And then obviously, the number has been bandied about in the $400-500 million a year range is what the Chinese market is worth to the NBA. But of course, they're trying to grow on a global scale. And I think there's been a perception that there are more growth opportunities available in China than perhaps here in the US.
Before we turn to fall 2019 and Daryl Mori, Hunter, can you talk a little bit to the talent development process in China? There was a big embarrassment. I was actually at the game that China lost to Venezuela, where like people were crying in the stands that they couldn't get out of the group stage of the Global Basketball Championships. But what is it about the system that team sports like soccer and basketball China hasn't really been able to achieve at the level that would be expected of a country so large and so committed to sports?
I'm glad you actually referred to that game, because I was not surprised at all when they lost to Venezuela, because that Chinese team is not that good. But like obviously, when it comes to national games, people here locally have a weird fantasy of how good they are. A lot of times they're like fantasized by nationalism field or just their pride or something. But I would say that, for example, a big component, if you want one takeaway from this discussion, is that the Chinese system for nurturing sports talents hugely relied on the 体校, the sports school, which is a separate system of athlete school that literally try to identify sports talents from the age of, I think, 8 or 10. So starting from primary school, like you got all these youth coaches, or for the juvenile level, they try to identify who are the real talents for which particular sport, which obviously you can see the influence from industrial policy or maybe a even more developed policy, ban policy, I guess. Then like that would be a problem for group sports in a sense that on a team level, a lot of the player development process comes to the players having that creation process or understanding how to actually play with a team. But like at age 8 or 10, it's very hard to tell, for example, who got the real eyes for passing, who really understand how to defend on the floor. And especially, for example, in basketball, the problem is that youth coaches literally oftentimes try to eye for the one who have the biggest chance to grow taller and who literally already can be faster and more explosive than other kids at the age of 8 or 10. And that's not very indicative of how much commitment they're going to put in, or how their basketball IQ are going to be, or how trained or how understanding they will be.
There's only so much motivation that you can provide externally to a player, and particularly if they're really being brought into the system of, hey, this is your life at age 8 or 10, that you're going to, even if you love it in the beginning, you're going to burn out at some point, I think. And especially if you get, maybe this is too much of a Western attitude to look at it with, but if you are told that this is what you're going to do and you're forced to do it, at some point there is either there's going to be a rebellion, or you're just going to not be as passionate about it as someone who's, yes, this is what I have chosen to do. I have talent with this. I started doing this because I love it. And then as it turned out, I was really good and I ended up making this my career. So it does seem like selecting group X is, we're going to focus everything on these guys. Well, then what happens if you don't get selected at age 8 or 10? Are you just out of the system completely?
I would add a little bit to that, because I guess I should also add in the thing with sports school and the thing with the early separation of kids are the biggest problem in my eyes is that you literally push the kids to a professional athlete's life. And the thing is that you can't push all the kids. So for example, the 1.3 billion people you just mentioned, like, oh, they should have so much talent in this talent pool, like such a large population, but literally only thousands, or I would say 3,000 to 4,000 kids are pre-selected for the sports school on the local level, which means that the 1.3 billion, most people are still crashed into common school, taking exams after exams. But you got all these people in the regular school dreaming about playing professional basketball, but they never really got regular coaching. And then the athlete school, they have no other choice. They might want to go to Tsinghua, be an engineer, be a scientist, but they never get a chance. And even and also that the youth coaches in the system, because it's fixed, it's not really that encouraging a market size system, and they're not really well paid enough, and they're not well trained enough in basketball knowledge or trying to update themselves or keeping track of how modern basketball have developed, and that has caused a huge lag between their understanding of basketball and what currently is playing right now.
It seems like Chinese children generally have a lot less free time due to some of the academic
Right,
pressures that are put on them
right.
compared to children in other areas. And so if you're not in this program where you're being groomed to be a professional athlete, you just don't really have time to just go out and play on the playground and have a good time with your friends and fall in love with the game. And then you can play. Is there like an equivalent of like playing for your high school or anything like that
No, no.
in China? Yeah.
The thing. Oh, I guess I should be fair that some of the school these days in the super large cities are trying to offer them, but that's only like part of like how the income inequalities are showing on the student education level. Like
Yeah.
you got all these rich kids and more than upper class kids in the large cities. They got all these access to not only basketball, soccer, but today American football as well. You got coaches literally designed for them when there's not even professional leagues of American football in China. They're literally just training for that sports, sometimes for their own recreation or for their say aspect for American colleges in the future. So there's a huge gap there, and like I often talk to a lot of my friends who also went to school in the States that like the first culture shock, if you're a sports fan, the huge culture shock a lot of times are that how accessible average US person have to sports chances or decent sports coaching or just regular
Yeah.
sports resources. Like they got all these access in middle school and primary school. You got coaches. Maybe somebody's father become the say football teacher or the soccer teacher, right? A lot of times that happens. But like even that father usually have had experience in wrestling or in other sports. They at least have a decent understanding of how to train your body, not in a totally deteriorating way. But like looking, if you're back this say a decade ago or 2 decades ago, ask a top Chinese school, they will hardly have anyone who have a decent training. And if you have somebody who goes to gym to train their muscles a lot, starting from middle school, people look at him like, oh, this guy is super weird. And you also have people having this sense of 五大三粗 or like thinking that too muscular are not smart enough, which is I'm just picking this out. It's not like everybody thinks this way, but it obviously,
Sure.
and a lot of the older generation, so like my parents and for people growing up from the 50s or 60s, actually does think that. So that also relates to China's history of respecting, say, intellectuals or literatities. But like, it's unfortunately how it contributes to the talent nurturing system right now.
Hunter, could you talk a little bit about the Gaokao reforms, physical education requirement?
I think that there has been generally calls to mix in sports and to take up a larger proportion of the Gaokao score or even the high school entrance, the 中考 score system. So like right now, the requirement for PE or for the sports are just you need to pass this specific test. Sometimes for boys or for guys are just pull ups or 1,000-meter run within a specific period of time, and you pass a specific number, and that's it. But like some people are trying to move the system to given that larger proportion, say if you do super well in sports, maybe you can get much more points. You can maybe add like 1/5 or 1/4 of what used to be a math exam or English exam or Chinese exam to account for in the exam system, which would really hugely motivate parents to push children to train themselves for the scoring purposes. But is that really for the professional athlete training purposes? I don't really know.
Hunter, so the really tall kids who play on the PKU and the Tsinghua and the Renmin basketball teams, do most of them come from the system?
Are you talking about the CUBA players?
Yeah, the CUBA players.
This is for Nate. This is a Chinese, I think, the undergraduate or rather, it's a basic equivalent of NCAA. But yeah, they mostly come from non-sports school systems. So they, or I think, or I'm not super sure on this. Maybe somebody dropped out of the sports school. They were originally training for some Olympic like sports and they lost that prospect. They switched to a regular school and then they try to make it still with their sports training by becoming this so-called special sports student. Or I don't know the teacher, the student with the special knack or special talents in sports. So there are indeed these kind of quotas for students who are talented in a particular sport, and it's not necessarily restricted to basketball or football or some other kind of sports. But Tsinghua and Beida obviously they are encouraging this, and they also have I think a good connection with already established athletes from the Olympics program who just want to get a master degree for a year or sometimes for other social sciences degrees relating to the sports industry. But right, the players are not really from the athlete school, from the sports school, which sometimes I think these days you're seeing the reforms by Yao trying to encourage college players from PKU, from Tsinghua to enter the CBA professional leagues, especially the development from the last 2 years is very refreshing.
Sure.
And
Hunter,
I
let's
want to
back
see
up a
more.
little bit. Talk about how Yao ended up running the CBA, which is the equivalent of the NBA in China. And what was the state he saw the CBA in, and what are the sorts of reforms that he's been pushing in his tenure?
Okay, he came in right now. It's probably his third year or fourth year reigning as the chairman of the CBA Association, but not the basketball league, the regulation aspect of it. But which is very rare because Yao is not really in the system, or Yao is not. I don't think he's a party member. He's in the 政协. He's in the. I actually don't know the English for that, but
He's in the MPC.
yeah,
right?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. He's always there. The weird super talk representative doesn't fit in with anyone. That's always his. Yeah, and he always proposed like reforms relating to sports or trying to encourage professional sports. That's true. But like for years, I've been a huge fan of Yao, but I never really expect him to get into that position of literally the leading figure of regulation of Chinese basketball because that's always literally most of the time that this kind of like a position of power reserved for the people or the officials coming from that sports school system or the local sports bureau system, which is very closely tied to that sports school system. And that's part of the problem when Yao came into the position. When they try to reform the system, you obviously are touching the cakes of people who are sitting on the sports bureau, and there's already a beneficial system for them when it comes to like how many years people work in this bureau, they're going to get to which sports school or this coaches can get promoted to a local sports bureau official. So there's a fixed system there, and there's a very reluctant force facing reforms. But Yao has been pushing one of the big reform I already mentioned is the CUBA's connection with CBA. So he pushed for the CBA lottery basically. Nowadays you have lottery system with CUBA talents came in, or sometimes even including players from Hong Kong, from Taiwan. They try to play professional basketball in CBA, and they can come in. This is actually very new. I think this it really established network and really like a lottery system, which means it can happen on an annual basis, and club can really reach out, having maybe a scout in the CUBA to actually try to identify talents is very rare. This is probably not a thing at all 5 years ago. So literally, this could be a signal to you of how raw the Chinese like talent developing system for basketball really
Sure.
is. And there are several other reforms Yao have been pushing for. I think he made some of the contractual agreement or the process much more professional. Like nowadays you can really see like how like when the free agency start, like how the player contract should be, or like how the agent should work. That's really not a thing. Maybe I think before Yao came on, and it's not just not really publicly like access. There's no public access for average sports fan or basketball fans to understand how like you can register as an agent or the free agent came in. There have been several famous cases of, for example, when Yi came back or when Ding Yuhang came back. That was the one he was with Shandong and he had that little stint with Dallas Mavericks, but didn't really work out because of his injury. But he came back and he had that huge fight or love hate relationship with his home team in Shandong. So you got all these huge star in CBA that kind of contribute to why there's a need of the professionalization of the contractual process. And Yao was a huge part of it, that one as well. And other reforms, including like pushing for smaller basketball to be more accessible in rural China, in places where really there's literally zero decent basketball education. So children can start with a smaller basketball. And these are some of the measures. And I should say this is very impressive comparing to the other, say, director of like Chinese football or Chinese soccer or director of other sports like regulation, because mostly they're not in the public that much. They talk about regulation disciplines, players morality that much, but not that much about the trying to marketize professional leagues in China.
Yeah, it's clear he's learned from his experience in the American system and also has the clout and knows how to play the game and in the back rooms to a level which is surprising for someone who spent most of his adult life in the States as opposed to going to Lianghui meetings and what have you. Nate, any reactions to that before I move on to the Hong Kong stuff?
I think it's interesting to talk about what it is that why it is that Chinese players have not been as good as has been hoped. If you look at Yao, he was a singular talent, 7'6", and I think actually that the Chinese system was really good for Yao in terms of just his ability to develop his shooting and his hook shot game and his fundamentals. But Yao is also a singular talent, and I think he also had a singular personality as someone just that everyone loved, who is just really like an awesome guy that loved basketball and really could fit in anywhere. And so if you look at some of the weaknesses of the Chinese national team in previous or in subsequent years after Yao, I mean, really guard play is the number one thing that you would look at that just hasn't been there. And that's something where you would think Chinese overall are shorter, but there's nothing that's preventing them from developing guards in the same way that any other culture is. Guards, really, you have to have the skill level. You have to have the passion. If you're a big guy, you can, and you're reasonably athletic and coordinated, like you can make it through without that high of a skill level. Guards, that's one of the biggest disappointments to me. And I think one of the biggest weaknesses of the system is just that that type of improvisational ability, the best way to develop that is playing on your own with more freedom, developing the passion, developing the self-start work ethic to really develop moves on your own, to play in an unstructured environment, to read the game. That's one of the biggest things. In addition to, they haven't really had that many really athletic guys other than maybe E to come out of China either. But those are the two biggest impediments that I've seen just in terms of the players that are being produced. We can talk about why it is that hasn't happened. We've hit on some of those things already. But those are the things to me that seem like why the Chinese have not been as competitive as they would like to be on the world stage.
The quick important thing about Yao is that he is very different. Like he is a total anomaly from that athlete school or sports school system. Like you rarely see somebody who are so intelligent as Yao and, like you say, so likable, so personable, which is very rare. Unfortunately, most of the kids who go to the sports school, they are pushing to a system that's like skewed in a way that's maybe not reflecting what real society could be like. So some of the athletes who came out of that system not really getting to that level, they have a little bit of a period of time adjusting to the regular society, and that already explains to it. And Yao also was super hardworking. Yao was probably one of the most hardworking athletes you ever find. Like he was, like, just to put it out there, he was a 85% shooting, like free throw shooting center.
He used to take the technical free throws.
That I explained to you, like how hard or how much attention he paid to honing his skills. Like coming back to for example, the guards, the problem of developing the guard, I think that still relates to how there's a huge lag between the Chinese coaching system back then and the system right now. Like you're starting to see like more and more guard, like the one you mentioned, and from the same team, Zhao Ziwei also play a very, I would say, Americanized style. So we actually, you see these local people call them like the Anshan Baoluo and the Liaoning Westbrook. So there's a Chris Paul of Anshan and the Westbrook of Liaoning, which is indicative of like Liu Wei style would never remind you of an American player like Westbrook or like Chris Paul. But so yeah, traditionally I think the coaching system really push like players into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that kind of a numbering to that fixed role purpose. So which means at point guard, they're really not encouraged to shoot for themselves. And if they shoot or if they score or try to create a bit on their own, they're going to be scolded by the coaches. Not always. Some coaches obviously will encourage it. But like a lot of times, coaches will be hard. And some of the famous coaches like Jiang Xingquan is a very renowned and respectable coaches in the Chinese system were famous for being harsh to players. And you got all these coaches that starting from the youth system tell the point guards, tell the shooting guards that this is your role. Like point guards, like just pass the ball, and shooting guards shoot the ball very well. But like I think overall that comes to the low level of competition on the junior level and the professional level. Like you have seen like the very talented scoring guard or the shooting guard, the Hu Weidong, which is nicknamed sometimes the Chinese Jordan, that was also playing in the 90s, and they were part of the team that beats I think Spain in the Barcelona Olympics or Atlanta. I'm not very sure, but like they got into the final eight for the Olympic basketball, which is that was unprecedented for that time. And on that team, you have like Hu Weidong leading everything. Like he was huge. He was like arguably the best guard China has ever seen for the national team, and that was from the 90s. So like the timing doesn't really explain everything, but like I would say that just the system really doesn't offer that much competition to players on a junior level, and the fact that I think the marketization of the sports system contribute to the fact that some of the coaches, very good coaches from the previously very planned institutionalized sports training system, they adjust very hard to that professional system, to the market economy. And you would, for example, like in the past, like if you're a good youth coach in China for basketball, that's all right. Like you have a decent salary, you have the same salary maybe for a state-owned businesses employee, and that's all right. You have a decent life. But like for a new bet or for a more younger generation, the market economy is here. Maybe if you are still a youth basketball coach, your earnings are maybe 1/10 or even less of a programmer or like a sales representative would make, and that would hugely like disencourage like people who have a real understanding of basketball or just like real talent, like trying to become a good coach. And that was also part of Yao came out of China 2002. So his training system or the training system he went through are really have accredited to the 90s system, but like or even before. But there's a huge gap when the market economy opens and the professional league are trying to develop. But like corruption were part of it, and like just the mismanagement of the CBA or the Chinese basketball in general contribute to why they're just not good coaching and not good youth development throughout that.
It's a real sad irony. I remember reading an interview with Evgeny Malkin, who's a Russian star hockey player who was from the absolute middle of nowhere. And I think someone asked him, like, how did you get your skill? And he was like, man, I just watched YouTube videos and I skated around and tried to do what they were doing in the NHL. There's enough NBA in China for kids to want to play like Steph Curry and Damian Lillard and whatnot. But the fact that there's a system which won't let them do that is, there are bigger tragedies in the world, but it's certainly unfortunate.
But it's getting better now. You like young kids literally, if they're a basketball fan, they watch American basketball, and like you can even find hardcore like followings of high school basketball in the States or NCAA these days in China. But the problem still is that most of the people that I just mentioned, the hardcore fans, they come from the regular. They never really get a chance to play professional or have a chance to train for professional basketball. Still, that problem exists, which is why I said the CBA lottery, the bridge between the college basketball and the professional basketball that Yao builds, just very fresh new, but very important for the future.
Nate, you want to walk us quickly through, just give us a refresher on the series of events that took place last year with regards to Daryl Mori and Hong Kong independence?
Right before the NBA China Games, Daryl Mori tweeted something that was supportive of Hong Kong. Free Hong Kong was it. And By the time everyone landed in China, there were a lot of people who were really upset. Ultimately, those games were played before no fans, taken off CCTV. They're only back on very recently. And, there were a lot of demands that action be taken against Daryl Mori. The NBA, despite having some slip-ups in terms of their messaging, including a Mandarin language statement that was a lot more conciliatory towards the Chinese Communist Party, they ultimately ended up supporting Morey's right to free speech and didn't really seem like they caved in, at least at that time. And now, a year later, the games are back on CCTV with the hiring of the founder of CCTV's son to head the NBA China.
Nate, can you talk a bit about the sort of reaction of the players, of the ownership, and the sort of fault lines that came down on, as well as how the NBA responded to what ended up becoming an enormous national controversy of senators, and I believe Trump as well, telling them not to back down?
Two questions there first. We'll start with what happened in the NBA. Essentially, what's happened is, and this is something that has happened with a number of American corporations trying to do business in China, there has been either overtly or more subtly a chilling of speech. Now, I think it's convenient for the NBA that very few players in the NBA, Rudy Gobert thus far is the only one, actually seem to have any sort of affinity for pointing out some of the excesses of the Chinese Communist Party. And so the fact that American players aren't really interested in those issues, they had a lot of backlash against Daryl Mori. So did a lot of people who worked in the league of just, hey, Daryl, why did you have to mess with our money? We had a good thing going in China. Why did you have to say something about this? And obviously, I was very disappointed in that, because I think that Daryl Mori has a very good point with his concerns. And there are some other people who likely agree with him. Steve Kerr probably does, but I thought Kerr was really an instructive example. He had actually tweeted something supportive of Hong Kong resistance, for lack of a better word, 3 weeks before Morey, which didn't get any attention for whatever reason. And then when he's asked about it, he's like, well, I need to become more educated on the issue. Clearly he doesn't. And then over the summer, he said that he wished that he had handled things differently and been more supportive of Daryl. But of course, still, he's not saying anything about the actual underlying cause, which, as a citizen of the world, Steve Kerr is well aware of what he thinks on it. But his speech is being chilled because he doesn't want to be the one who's messing up everyone's money. LeBron James had a $1 million sponsorship appearance that he just lost because of this, right? And so if you're Steve Kerr, you don't want to be antagonizing the players in the NBA and making them lose money by your political beliefs. And of course, that's exactly the way that the Chinese Communist Party would love for it to be, where they don't have to tell you not to say it, because it's clear what's going to happen if you do say it. And so then from their mindset, I think everybody wins, because the speech is chilled, no one says it, and then there doesn't have to be any punishment.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because, like, the players have clearly demonstrated in the past few months that they're comfortable losing money for issues they care about. So it's not entirely
I would push back on that, Jordan. I don't believe that the players necessarily think that they are going to lose money for speaking up on these issues. Now, maybe they will. Maybe the ratings will go down. There's a big imbroglio about that now, whether the ratings are down in part due to some of these political statements. But I think that certainly in the main consumers for the NBA, the bulk of the consumers are totally supportive of all of these social justice things. So and certainly there isn't as direct a relationship as there is of just, oh yeah, your games are off TV here in China and no one's allowed in, and your sponsorship appearance has been canceled. There's definitely nothing that is that direct. Colin Kaepernick is showing up in Nike ads, right?
Sure.
So it's certainly among most of the people in the NBA. I don't think that there is an understanding of, okay, we're going to lose money. And ultimately, when it's been, hey, are we going to just straight up boycott this? No, nobody was willing to do that. And just maybe a couple people were, but generally players were not willing to do that. when there really is a lot of money on the line.
Sure. Hualun, could you talk a little bit about broader social media response as opposed to strictly the government's one? I remember seeing things on both sides of blog posts saying this is a big overreaction and others saying burning jerseys and what have you. What was your take at the time, and how has this conversation evolved over the past year?
At that time, I was very confused by how quick the situation intensified. Like, to be honest, like at first when I saw the Daryl Mori's tweet, I was not directly thinking of that much of the implications because at that time, obviously, most of the mainlanders don't follow what happened in Hong Kong that much due to all kind of reasons.
Sure.
But the thing is that like the banner he put on at that time was not directly related to independence or claims. They were related to the extradition bills and like the rights or the movement that's related to it. So like it could be interpreted in that way later. I soon realized by obviously the backlash. But like at that first moment, I was like, oh, okay, that's just another one. Like, why does it matter? But then over the night, it quickly burned over everything. I think, unfortunately, the social network in China last year specifically has been super reactive to this. I'm guessing it partly because it happened during the national holiday or the National Day holiday, I should say. So that was when maybe, and last year was also the 70-year National Day celebration, which is also even more important or influential in the Chinese context, which might stir up more nationalism where people have feelings for the identity or for China as a country. And then I think the problem is that recently, due to the trade war, I think like literally starting from the trade war or from there's the obvious turning point when China and US have deteriorating relationships diplomatically. Most of the things in the Chinese internet, due to the regulation, can be put into a filter or can be put into a specific perspective due to the power of, for example, each platforms to try to comply with local laws or whatever local officials are interested in, which reflect whatever Beijing is interested in. So the platforms might be interested to remove the content that they don't want to see and just stay the content that they like. And that would really hugely tilted what the reality might be or what people really might think. So the problem I always have for these NBA, Hong Kong, China controversy was the Chinese authority really interested in this, or was they caught by surprise, or were they partially interested in moving it in such a drastic direction? But I don't really know, but I'm guessing there's a factor there. And social network was these days in China is so easily manipulated. Obviously, like you just need to make sure that the platforms comply with you, and like you just go to the platforms and tell them, like, oh, and this happens on a daily basis, right? Each platform or each news outlet, they can receive a indoor notice that, oh, coming from this should not go on. It's like these days, social media works in such a way that like it's very difficult to see how people actually feel. Like you judging by the appearance, it's very difficult. But obviously, what people make of the appearance might shape their feelings in the future. I would say that like comparing to what happened with Mesut Ozil of Arsenal, that was the soccer player was in the Premier League who issued later, I think who issued on his Twitter or Instagram a huge blog post supporting the Xinjiang or crying out loud. That was actually handled not that like drastically by the Chinese like foreign ministry, and I think I would quote they actually responded to Mesut's post by saying that we invite Mesut Ozil to tour Xinjiang to see the reality. So obviously it's not as harsh as what the foreign ministry have done to the Daryl Mori's tweet of the Hong Kong supporting for Hong Kong.
Sure.
Or I find it ironic that actually last year, part of the timeline, you can see the Chinese consulate in Houston saying that they're disappointed by the tweet of Daryl Mori, and nowadays the consulate is gone. So like that tells you where we are on this whole thing. So it's a crazy era, and social media unfortunately makes everything happen so much faster.
Yeah, no, it's interesting with the Xinjiang dynamics, right? Because there was a nationalist button that the powers that be clearly wanted to push when Hong Kong was in the news, but Xinjiang is something that's much more awkward for the government to promote and defend. Thanks so much for coming on ChinaTalk.
耀眼。来来往往，匆匆忙忙，人群之中，多少离别，跌跌撞撞，摇摇晃晃，展翅蝴蝶，绝不停歇，条条框框，远远方方，或许你也早已厌倦。要超越了记忆，过了时间，从海上天，跑过了一天，已时过境迁。星星点点，近近远远，浩瀚夜空，装进飞浪，深深浅浅，弯弯延延，鱼儿想要留下记号，疯疯癫癫，无不变变，美妙歌声耳边萦绕，神秘的耶利亚。万众瞩目的上空，让我来做你背后的英雄。时空就让它失控，就在乎留下真挚的感动。让我们岁月摆脱互相认同，也不由所有的人的懂。听不懂，看不懂，我激动，我们向前冲。太空漫步登场，踏浪出征，迎来掌声。鼓点敲打胸膛，不要走神，我要开始歌唱。热情揭开了心中的结。好威风，目光锁定我。来吧来吧，莫动一时便有其他想法。光锋闪电不能将我怎样多么潇洒。如果这种快乐就像所想旋转木马，那么赐我能量风这天下让步。金钱飞舞伴随经验是整洁的月。面带笑容，透露幸福，表达了一切。烟火漫天，亲密无间，缤纷的世界。旋转跳跃，展演放对误会的主角。原来的 party， 完美的 party， 灯火火光里遍满幸福。原来的 party， 完美的 party， 烽火尘冒让别人羡慕。原来的 party， 隐藏着天随的衣服，上身剩下肌肤。原来的 party， 完美的 party， 不在乎最后外面谢幕。心中的结，好威风，目光锁定，热情揭开了心中的结，好威风，目光锁定，赶紧吧，赶紧步伐，快点吧，快乐放大。蹦蹦跳跳，说说笑笑，让爱缠绕你我之间，纷纷扰扰，只找暖暖，那些画面停在昨天。花花草草，寻寻找找，温暖它的魔法季节。光出现，多耀眼，来来往往，匆匆忙忙，人群之中，多少离别，跌跌撞撞，摇摇晃晃，展翅蝴蝶，绝不停歇，条条框框，远远方方，或许你也早已厌倦。星星点点，近近远远，浩瀚夜空，装进飞棒，深深浅浅，弯弯延延，鱼儿想要留下记号，疯疯癫癫，无不翩翩，美妙歌声耳边萦绕。不管是光芒雷雨闪电，树立个标杆，更需要历练。手段不质疑，但不会改变。接受纯真的搏斗实验，想象马也有大力气，撼动了局势的奇迹。每当这首舞曲响起，要释放我现的生命力。断了线，擦了线，盖了钱包里面没变，看了遍，毁了见，关了眼，继续去冒险。冰火击退了，被破了，斩中了天的怀念，能量无限突破红线，写下你的诗篇。我无本残留，将凭全力够爽，哪怕是梦一场，也算有理想。风里闯，雨里狂，属我最善良，心里有最老，我让最坚牢。好威风，目光锁定。细节间的多是一个高级 boy， 靠近时间才是我的音乐所以。你在4.1把我躲在被子抽泣，我地区对类似转信息钢化玻璃。我是一个王子，王球王子哈，爱情里我会特别强势哈，什么方式你会放肆哈，我请你吃麻辣烫最高档次哈，每个手指都戴他的戒指，这样才能被叫做 fashion。不惜眼神，双手插进口袋，这样女孩才会觉得你很爆破。我的衣服光是so with 爆破，头发像烟花绽放 just 爆破，没有钱让我的艺术人生爆破，学妹爆破全都夸我时尚穿的脖子夸我如果你也觉得这很竖起你的大拇指踏进我眼眸，已经触 满了对我的爱慕赞说，我假装没事做，只在一旁玩弄夏令的借口。伸过来一只手带着我说，帅哥等一下我有够，抓着我的挥霍摩托。前面堵车我按下喇叭，摩托音响外面 Travis Scott 小气保安，我必须我3万3，说起电车的感觉自己长大，说没有人跟我比，2年前没过冰，现在看看我的辣，从后那是辣的线。左肩复古的潮流的破洞，坐上我后座，承担起作用。哥们帅气的 flexing 在风中，潮流的领动点英文加 icon， 拍着风景点妹妹，感受下劲的推背，耍着那神叫 baby。哪里出了这赛车？帅帅帅帅帅帅帅车！哪里出了这赛车？帅帅帅帅帅帅帅车！